Rome had won. The legions came home, and with them arrived something history books rarely linger on. Picture it for a moment. You're standing on a dust-choked road in the year 70 AD. The air is dry. The sun hangs low and merciless. In the distance, a triumphal procession moves steadily toward the eternal city. Banners ripple in the wind. Bronze armor flashes beneath the light. Thousands of boots strike the earth in perfect rhythm. The legions march in flawless formation, an image of order, discipline, and victory. And among them, bound together with iron chains, are hundreds of women. Their eyes are hollow, their faces slack with exhaustion. Many already understand something terrible, that death would have been kinder than what lies ahead. They march not as prisoners in the modern sense, but as proof, living evidence of Rome's absolute power. This is the story of what followed Roman conquest, of what happened when the legions took a city, of the fate reserved for female prisoners of war, of practices that turned military victory into something far darker than territorial control. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is preserved in generals' letters, in the writings of ancient historians, in legal records that have survived nearly 2,000 years. And yet, it has been carefully excluded from school curricula and cinematic epics alike, because some truths are too unsettling to present openly. Before we continue into this deliberately forgotten history, support this channel dedicated to uncovering the past as it truly was. Subscribe and leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it allows us to keep revealing what power worked so hard to erase. We are taught about Rome's glory, about invincible legions conquering the known world, about victorious generals parading along the Via Sacra as crowds erupted in celebration, about prisoners of war displayed as symbols of imperial dominance. The official story is simple. The captives became slaves. They were sent to mines, to farms, to the households of wealthy patricians. A brutal fate, certainly, but one framed as a standard consequence of ancient warfare. This is the version that survives. Clean, orderly, almost clinical. But the surviving documents tell a different story. According to a military report preserved in the British Museum, dating to the reign of Trajan after the Roman conquest of Dacia in 106 AD, approximately 15,000 women were taken captive. The official record mentions only their distribution among the legions and their later transfer to the provinces. Distribution, a word so administrative, so bloodless, until you read the personal accounts. Letters written home, private diaries found in abandoned forts, notes never meant for history. Then that word begins to mean something else entirely. Because what happened to these women before they ever became domestic slaves was a ritual of systematic humiliation, a celebration of victory carved into the bodies of the defeated, a political act disguised as battlefield brutality. But can it even be called brutality when it was calculated, organized, and sanctioned by the Roman state itself? When a city fell, there was a sequence, not chaos, procedure. First, men of fighting age were separated. Some were executed immediately. Others were spared, reserved for the arena. Children and the elderly were deemed useless, abandoned, expelled, or killed, depending on logistical necessity. Then came the women. Young women formed a distinct category. They were treated differently. They were assembled in the central square of the conquered city, stripped bare beneath the sun and the gaze of the entire legion. They remained there for hours, sometimes days, while officers conducted selections. The most physically desirable were marked with red dye on the left shoulder and set aside for commanders. The rest were allocated to rank-and-file soldiers. There was even a formal Latin designation for this process: praeda belli femininarum, female war spoils. The term appears in military manuals, in official correspondence. Yes, taxes were levied on this property. A fragment of a letter discovered in Pompeii, written by a legionary named Marcus Flavius during the campaign in Germania, describes the scene with chilling detachment. "I took 3 for myself on the first night," he wrote. "The youngest cried without stopping. The second tried to bite. The third simply stared at nothing, as if she were already gone. I preferred the third. She was easier." That word, easier, echoes across centuries, because it reveals something essential about this violence. It wasn't driven solely by desire. It was about domination, about erasing dignity before erasing identity, about turning human beings into objects before formally enslaving them. Roman generals understood the political purpose of this ritual perfectly. This was not about releasing tension after long campaigns. It was a demonstration of total power. A message delivered without ambiguity to any population considering resistance. This is what happens to your daughters, your sisters, your wives. And the message worked. The Roman historian Tacitus describes the revolt led by Boudica in Britain in 60 AD. He records that Boudica herself and her daughters were publicly violated by Roman officers after their capture, not as personal punishment, but as a calculated example of imperial authority. The warrior queen who dared defy Rome was reduced to spectacle. Her daughters, princesses by birth, transformed into instruments of instruction. When Boudica later rose again, she was no longer fighting for land alone. She fought for revenge that could never be satisfied, for dignity that could never be restored, for screams forced into silence. She was defeated, and what became of the women of her tribe after the final suppression was never fully recorded. We know only this: Britannia did not rebel again for 3 centuries. Is silence proof of peace? Or is it the result of terror so complete that even speech is taken away? But this was only the beginning. After the first days, after the ritual of domination, came the bureaucratic phase, the conversion of people into property. Survivors were branded, hot irons pressed into flesh, burning symbols that identified the legion that captured them and the campaign in which they were taken. Marks of ownership carved into skin, often on the face, so their status could never be concealed. Then came transport. Chained together in groups of 10 or 20, they were forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward the ports. There they waited in dark, damp warehouses, the same buildings used to store grain and olive oil, until enough ships became available. They were stored. A commercial inventory preserved in Alexandria, dated to 115 AD, records the mixed cargo of a merchant vessel: 340 amphorae of wine, 120 barrels of wheat, 89 women from Judea, 14 Berber horses. Women listed alongside wine and horses. Same ledger, same accounting category, same logistical value. The sea crossing lasted weeks. They were kept below deck, chained in rows, with barely enough space to sit upright. No room to lie down. Daily rations calculated precisely to keep them alive, nothing more. Many died during the journey, disease, dehydration, or simply surrender. Their bodies were thrown into the sea without ceremony or record. A Roman treatise on estate management from the 1st century estimates that an acceptable loss rate during transport of female war captives was between 20 and 30%. Acceptable, as if discussing spoiled produce. And when they finally arrived in Rome, or any major city of the empire, the next stage began. The auctions. The auctions were held in specialized markets, places designed for the inspection and sale of human beings. These were not hidden corners of the city. They operated openly, regulated by law, taxed by the state, attended by Rome's wealthiest citizens. Buyers moved slowly through the rows, examining bodies as one would livestock, hands pressed into flesh, teeth inspected, mouths forced open, signs of illness, injury, or pregnancy carefully checked. Every flaw reduced value. Every sign of youth increased it. The youngest and most physically desirable commanded extraordinary prices. They were purchased by patrician households, elite brothels, and temples that offered specialized services to devotees of certain Eastern cults. Ownership of such women carried social prestige. They were trophies, proof that conquest extended even into the private sphere. The rest, those whose appearance had deteriorated during transport, those marked by scars, those who resisted, those who had broken mentally, were sold in bulk. Mines, farms, workshops. In those places, life expectancy rarely exceeded 5 years, but there was a fate considered worse than the mines: the brothel. These establishments existed in every Roman city. They were legal, regulated, taxed. The Roman state profited from every transaction, and female prisoners of war were the most sought-after commodity of all. Why? Because they were foreign, because they came from defeated peoples, because violating the daughter of an enemy gave ordinary Roman men a sense of participation in imperial conquest. A man who had never carried a shield or drawn a sword could, for a few coins, feel like a victor, a conqueror by proxy. A piece of graffiti found in Pompeii, scratched into the wall of a brothel, reads simply, "Here I penetrated a Briton. Rome was eternal." Even the most intimate act was transformed into a political statement. The women in these places had no names. They were identified only by origin: the Gaul, the German, the Jew. Their identities erased, replaced by geography and defeat. They worked in cubicles smaller than 2 square meters, no windows, a single curtain as a door. They serviced between 10 and 20 men per day, sometimes more during festivals. There was no retirement, no release, no exit. Many turned to suicide. Others lost their sanity entirely. A very small number survived long enough to be freed. But freedom did not undo what had been done. The brand on the face remained. The memory in the body remained. In the 2nd century, a Roman physician named Soranus of Ephesus wrote a treatise on gynecology. One chapter addressed illnesses common among women used in war prostitution. He described chronic inflammation, premature infertility, recurring hemorrhages. Then he added, almost as an aside, that brothel owners were advised to renew their stock every 3 or 4 years, as after this period, the merchandise lost commercial value and productive capacity. Renew the stock, as one might replace cracked jars. And all of this entire industrial system of dehumanization, functioned openly. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was denied. There was no shame. It was simply considered the natural order of things, the logical outcome of military victory. Rome won, and the defeated paid with everything they were and everything they might have become. The question lingers: how much of this calculated coldness still survives in modern wars, merely under different names? Behind this wall of historical silence lies something even darker. There are almost no first-person accounts. The victims themselves left no written testimony. They could not write the language of their conquerors. They had no access to materials. And even if they had, who would have preserved their words? Yet there are rare exceptions. disturbing ones. In the 2nd century, a woman named Blandina appears in early Christian writings. She had been enslaved after being captured during a campaign in Gaul. While serving in a Roman household, she converted to Christianity. When her faith was discovered and she was arrested, she spoke during interrogation about her past. One surviving fragment records her words. "They asked if I feared death. I told them I had already died many times. They killed me the night my village burned. They killed me on the march to the sea. They killed me in the ship's hold. They killed me the first time a Roman man called me property. Death before the lions would only confirm what was already true." Blandina was executed in the arena, but her words endured. They reveal something essential. The trauma was not only physical, it was existential. The destruction was not merely of the body, but of the very idea of being human. These women learned a terrible truth, that dignity, identity, and human worth are not fixed. They are conventions, and conventions can be revoked instantly. You are human only as long as someone stronger allows you to be. As long as Rome prevailed, that convention held. When Rome conquered, it ended. And once broken, it could never be fully repaired. Even when freed, even when escaped, even decades later. The fracture remained, because the revelation could not be unlearned. Another document from the 2nd century records a rebellion of enslaved women in a rural settlement in Spain. They killed the owner and his family in the middle of the night. When they were captured, the leader, a Germanic woman identified in the records only as the red-haired one, was brought before a judge prior to execution. She spoke once. "You taught us that the world belongs to the violent," she said. "We only practiced the lesson." She was crucified alongside 17 others, but her words endured because they exposed the central hypocrisy of the entire system. Rome saw itself as civilization. It believed it brought order, law, and structure to a barbaric world, that it replaced chaos with discipline, that it elevated humanity through conquest. But that civilization was built on systematic violence, on the calculated exploitation of bodies and inner lives of the defeated. And when the defeated turned that same logic back upon Rome, they were no longer participants in the natural order. They were criminals. A Roman historian writing centuries later captured this contradiction almost by accident. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 5th century, described events during the invasions of the Huns, incursions that would help fracture the Roman Empire itself. He noted something unsettling. Some Roman women taken captive during these invasions appeared strangely resigned to their fate. Not hysterical, not defiant, resigned. As if they recognized something familiar in what was happening to them. A distant echo of what their own ancestors had once inflicted upon others. History folding inward on itself. Rome harvesting what it had sown. But this recognition redeemed no one. It did not spare those Roman women. It did not lessen the horror awaiting them. It merely revealed a nauseating truth. Human beings possess an almost limitless capacity to turn the pain of others into system, into tradition, into routine, into something that feels normal. And when one system collapses, another waits beneath it. The machinery changes hands. The logic remains. So the question emerges: have we truly evolved, or have we merely changed the clothing of the same cruelty? History books rarely dedicate more than a paragraph to the fate of prisoners of war in antiquity. And when women are mentioned at all, the language becomes deliberately vague, enslaved, exploited. This careful silence exists for a reason. As the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg once observed, The boundary between the sacred and the profane is thin and almost always drawn by power. Rome became the civilizational template for the Western world. Its legal framework shaped modern law. Its military organization influenced contemporary armies. Its architecture is still copied in capitals across the globe. To fully confront the systematic nature of Roman sexual violence would require questioning the foundations of that admiration. It would require acknowledging that civilization carries a cost, and that the cost is almost always paid by the most vulnerable. So instead, we choose elegance. We choose silence. We focus on aqueducts, on roads, on laws. We celebrate Julius Caesar as a brilliant military mind, while forgetting that his campaigns in Gaul resulted in the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of women and children. We watch films in which gladiators fight heroically for freedom. Yet we never see what existed just beyond the arena walls. We never see the brothel beside the Colosseum. We never see the lines of men waiting their turn with newly arrived captives, because that would be uncomfortable. And discomfort is precisely what history demands. There is a tombstone in a museum in London, dated to the 2nd century. It was discovered near what was once a Roman fort in Britain. The inscription is brief, almost apologetic in its restraint. Here once was a woman, her name forgotten, her homeland forgotten. May the gods show her more mercy than Rome did. No name, no story, only an acknowledgement of suffering too heavy to carve into stone. How many others were there? Millions. Across 6 centuries of imperial expansion, countless women passed through the same cycle. Born free, captured, violated, enslaved, erased, their lives reduced to figures in military reports, numbers in commercial inventories, footnotes in history books most people never open. But every statistic was a complete human life. A girl with a name, with parents, with dreams. A woman who loved and was loved. A full human being reduced to an object by men who believed victory granted them that right. This was not a single night of uncontrolled rage. It was methodical, repeated, normalized. It was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization functioning exactly as designed. As one anthropologist would later argue, war is not the breakdown of order. It is its foundation. Every state is born from the ability to organize violence on an industrial scale. Rome proves the argument. These horrors were not the result of chaos. They were the product of perfect order. The machine operated smoothly. Soldiers followed procedure. Merchants conducted business. Citizens visited licensed establishments and paid their taxes. Everything was legal. Everything was justified. Everything was considered natural. How many modern systems speak the same language? How many present-day cruelties are defended by necessity? By security? By order? The weeping of millions of women whose names were never carved into stone still lingers beneath the ruins. They built Rome as much as its engineers and generals did. They built it with their bodies, with their lives, with everything they were and everything they might have been.